Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahi ma sha Allah la quwwata illa billah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa tabi'ina lahum bi ihsan ila yawm ad-din. Wa alayna ma'ahum wa fihim bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. We intend to learn and teach, remember and remind, to share mutual benefit as well as to gain, to encourage holding fast to Allah's book and the Sunnah of His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, to call to guidance and lead to good, seeking in that Allah's countenance, Allah's pleasure, nearness to Allah and His reward subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we intend with the author Hujjatul Islam Al-Imam Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali intended, as well as our sheikhs, and the pious and what Allah knows of good intentions. We ask Allah to accept and to grant us benefit in khair and lutf and afiyah. So we are continuing this blessed treatise, the beginning of guidance. And last week, alhamdulillah, we completed the first part, which is acts of obedience. And we are beginning today the second part on refraining from disobedience. Al-qawl fi ijtinab al-ma'asi. Right? What he has to say regarding avoiding the various acts of disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And alhamdulillah, in our last lesson, we were reminded of fasting, particularly virtuous days, or fasting the days that are virtuous, in particular the day of Ashura, which was the 10th of Muharram. So we hope that we fasted that, those of us that are permitted to fast and didn't have an excuse such as illness or travel that prevented us from the fast. And as we mentioned in our lessons related to Ramadan, an etiquette of fasting and every other good deed is after that to remain in a state of fear and hope for the acceptance of that deed. So after fasting a day like Ashura, one shouldn't assume that one was accepted, but one should hope one was accepted, though fear due to the discrepancies that one knows exist, or the lack of sincerity which one fears may exist, that one's deed would not be accepted. So after that, we should ask Allah to accept, and we ask Allah to accept the works of the previous week, whether those were fasting Ashura, whether those were the day of Jumu'ah, whether those were lessons or dhikr or recitation of Quran, and so on. And the believer should do that with all of their good deeds, be preoccupied with the acceptance of those deeds. And then Ashura, if it was accepted, we have the glad tidings from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that expiates the sins of the previous year. And we ask Allah that by His mercy, and He's the most merciful of the merciful. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. So now he is going to talk about the matter of avoiding disobedience. So he says, part 2 on refraining from disobedience. Know that this religion is made up of 2 parts. One of them is refraining from disobedience, and the other is the performance of acts of obedience. The first part is more important and more serious, right? So he said, "I'lam anna ad-din shatran." "I'lam anna ad-din shatran." You could say the religion is 2 parts, or the religion is 2 halves. Yes, please. Right? The religion is 2 parts or 2 halves. One of them, obedience, and the other, avoiding disobedience. And then he mentions that avoiding disobedience, he says, is more serious, or he translates this as more important and more serious. From one point of view, it's also, you could say, it's given initial concern. And what do we mean by that? We mean that actually avoiding disobedience, being pure from sin, precedes adorning oneself with obedience, right? Now, this is a manual that's very elementary, and he wanted to give daily, and I guess you could even say weekly and monthly and yearly devotional work. So he gave Awrad in the beginning, but typically a work in spirituality, it will treat repentance as a fundamental, if not one of the earliest discussions, right? And the Imam himself in Ihya, when he talks about purification, he says that half of the religion is being purified from the various things that we must be purified from, and the other half is being adorned with the things that we would be adorned with, right? So he's drawing from the hadith, at-tuhur shatrul iman, that purification is half of faith, right? So the first half of any virtuous work is purity, and the second half is being adorned, right? I'm just saying this to emphasize the enormous and fundamental importance of avoiding disobedience, right? So as purity pertains to prayer, obviously you make wudu prior to you pray. As it pertains to the heart, being rid of vice precedes being adorned with virtue. As it pertains to the limbs, you could say that tawbah, refraining from ma'asiyah, precedes adorning oneself with additional voluntary good deeds, right? Because neglecting an obligation is itself sin, right? So just understand that enough cannot be said for the importance of avoiding disobedience, right? And he mentions, when he talks in the Ihya about the stations of certitude, right? Or the stations, spiritual stations. The first of the stations he mentions is at Tawbah, is repentance. And he said, Tawbah, repenting from sin, right? Repenting from sin with respect to spiritual stations is as a parcel of land is with respect to building. That someone who has no parcel of land cannot build. And someone who has no Tawbah will have no station, nor will they have any state, right? So all of this just to say that avoiding disobedience is you could say more important and serious, and you could also say it's fundamental and primary, right, in one's progress, avoiding acts of disobedience. And again, does that mean that you don't pray and then start avoiding disobedience and then go back to prayer? No, of course not, right? That itself would be disobedience. And he authored this manual in the way he did for that reason. Obviously, you're praying through all of this time and what have you. However, it's really important to avoid disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one can't expect to build anything of progress without making tawbah and without avoiding acts of disobedience, right? And one cannot expect to avoid them without learning them. So that's what he's going to outline here. He's going to begin outlining what are these acts of disobedience such that we can avoid them. So he said that, again, avoiding acts of disobedience is more serious, important. You could also say it's more difficult, right? It's more difficult. Everyone has the capacity to carry out acts of obedience, but only the truly sincere can abandon their appetites and desires. And the word he actually says is as-siddiqun, right? So he says everyone is able to perform obedience, right? And there's perhaps you could say some hyperbole in that, but meaning, there will be this person's able to give charity, it's easy for them, so they'll give a lot of charity. This other person, fasting's easy for them, they'll do a lot of that. Some people, maybe prayer, maybe lessons, dhikr, what have you. There'll be various voluntary works of obedience that a person may incline to, and it's easy to do a lot of them, right? However, the element of sabr an al-ma'asi, right? With restraining oneself from disobedience that is more difficult, right? And he's saying, he translates this as a truly sincere, or the Arabic is illa siddiqun, right? People of siddiq or veracity, right? The veracious saints, and the siddiqun is a level of saints, right? ولذلك قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم المهاجر من هجر السوء والمجاهد من جاهد هوى, right? And this is narrated by Mustadrak, and there's various phrases of this hadith. The true immigrant is the one who abandons evil, and the true mujahid is the one who fights his passions or her passions, right? So that's truly difficult, right? It's a true jihad to fight one's hawa, right? One's vain desires. And may Allah grant us that. So what does that say? That says we should be very careful of disobeying Allah, right? Imam Haddad said we should treat sin as poison, right? And avoid it like we would poison. Bismillah. Right, so what is it poison for? It's poison for our hearts. It's poison for our hearts. So now he's going to mention, he's going to list various types of ma'asiyah, various types of disobedience that must be avoided. So he says, know that you disobey Allah with your limbs. You could also, in this context, limbs is probably the best translation. While they are a bounty from Allah and a trust to you. So you're using the bounties of Allah Most High to disobey Him is the ultimate ingratitude, and you're betraying the trust, and you're betraying the trust He has placed with you is the ultimate tyranny. Indeed, the parts of your body are your subjects, so pay attention to how you govern them. Each of you is a shepherd, and each of you is answerable for his flock. And that's a well-known hadith narrated in Al-Bukhari, right? So he's saying that that the various limbs and organs we have, like our eyes, like our tongues, like our hands, and so on, our ears, that those are bounties of Allah, right? So when we disobey Allah with them, that's ingratitude, and it's a betrayal of a trust that we've been given, right? And Junayd bin Muhammad, he defined gratitude as Allah not being disobeyed with His blessings. Allah yu'sala bi ni'ami, that Allah not be disobeyed with His blessings, right? So that's what Imam Haddad is, Imam Ghazali is saying here, right? It's ingratitude, and it's a betrayal of a trust. He's also saying that you're a governor, right? You are a governor or a steward. He's translating here as shepherds, translating the hadith, kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'ulun an ra'iyatihi. Each of you is a steward, and each will be asked about his wards, or each of you is a ruler, and each of you will be asked about his subjects, right? And in the context of this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the emir will be asked about the subjects, and a husband will be asked about his wife, and a wife will be asked about her husband's house and the children. And each of you is a steward, and each of you will be asked about his or her wards, right? So what he's saying is that your organs are also some of your wards, right? And the Imam oftentimes uses that analogy, that the human being is like a kingdom, right? And the heart is the king, and the faculties and organs and limbs are its subjects, right? So we'll be asked about the justice and the wisdom with which we govern this kingdom that is us, right? And many of us, there's a lot of Islamic, political ideologies that want to attain governance. They want to establish an Islamic state. Well, the one state that you definitely can govern and you definitely will be asked about is you, right? So if we allow our eyes to disobey Allah, that's a form of tyranny, the Imam is saying. We allow our tongues to disobey Allah. That is a form of tyranny. And كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. And each of you is a steward, and each of you will be asked about his or her wards, right? And that's what we can do. That's what we can do, and that's what we will be asked about. And we ask Allah to grant us to give victory to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in these organs of ours. And as we've said in some other lessons, that if we want to see things established in the world and in the ummah, we should first establish them within ourselves, right? So if we want to see honesty established in the community, we should establish it on our own tongues and in our own dealings. If we want to see chastity, we should establish it with our own eyes and our own tongues and so on, right? Not look at things that are impermissible, as will be mentioned, or speak in a way that is impermissible and unchaste and what have you, right? To the end of it. And each of us, that is within his or her capacity, provided, that there's an ordinance, a decree of tawfiq for that person. Naam. La ilaha illallah. So he says, he continues, and he says, know that all your limbs will testify against you in the plains of judgment with clear, eloquent speech, as Allah will expose your faults in front of an assembly of creation. Allah Most High says, on the day when their tongues, their hands, and their feet will testify against them as to what they used to do, right? And that is in the Quran. يَوْمَ تَشْهَدْ عَلَيْهِمْ أَلْسِنَتُهُمْ وَأَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَرْجُلُهُمْ بِمَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. Allah also says, on this day, we will seal their mouths, and their hands will speak to us, and their feet will testify as to what they have earned. Right? اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون. Right? So these organs will testify. Right? These organs will testify against us for our misuse of them. Right? Or testify for us. Right? As to our obedience with them. He said, so guard your entire body, especially 7 parts of it. For verily hell has 7 gates, through each of which a particular group is destined to enter. Right? So he's saying that there are 7 organs that we should protect from disobedience, and there are 7 gates to hell. Right? And we're protected from those 7 gates by guarding our 7 limbs from disobedience, right? So he says, the only one designated to enter these gates are those who disobeyed Allah Most High by means of these parts. So what are these 7 limbs, or 7 parts, or organs, you could say? Al-A'da as-Sab'a, right? And he'll reference this in various books, and other authors will reference it, deriving from his treatment of this subject, right? So he's basically going to divide our bodies into 7 parts and say that each part should be protected from the types of obedience that is possible with that organ, right? So these 7 organs are the eye, the ear, the tongue, the stomach, the private area, meaning the genitalia, meaning that one is chaste, the hand, and the foot, right? So one is to guard each of these from disobedience, right? And taqwa, he says in Minhaj al-Abidin, one will only attain taqwa by guarding these various organs and maintaining each of them in obedience, right? So one will only have taqwa if one has taqwa of the eye and of the ear and of the tongue and so on, right? And each of these organs, there's knowledge that will help you have taqwa with that organ, right? So the eye, he's going to reference some of it, and so on. Assalamu alaikum. He says, as for the eye, It was created for you only so that you might be guided by it in the darkness, that you might be helped by it with respect to your needs, that by it you might see the wonders in the dominions of the heavens and the earth and consider the signs they contain, right? And this is one fundamental of every limb, right, or every organ, is that you reflect on the thing for which it was created and how to use it in that way, and not misuse it, right? So what is that doing? That's reflecting on gratitude. One definition of gratitude is that each blessing is used for its the purpose for which it was created, right? So if we look at the eye, he mentions one of the spiritual benefits of the eye, and he said that you look at the wonders, and he says in the dominion of the heavens and the earth, you might say the kingdom of the heavens and the earth, right? Fi malakutu samawati wal ard, right? The wonders fi malakutu samai wal ard, right? That you ponder the wonders in Allah's creation. That's one of its purposes. He also mentions that it was created to gaze upon the noble countenance of Allah in other books, right? The eye was created to gaze upon the countenance of Allah in the hereafter. The eye was created to gaze upon the speech of Allah, to look at believers with respect, right? And also to ponder the wonders in His creation. So one reflects on its purpose, and an organ that's of that nobility, it's not becoming that it be used to disobey Allah. And our disobeying Allah with this eye might deprive us from seeing Him in the hereafter, subhanahu, right? And that would be the greatest loss, because that's the greatest bliss in the akhirah, is the beatific vision, right? And if we misuse this eye, it might be a cause of sin and distance from Allah and punishment and being veiled from Him, rather than being an organ by which we have the beatific vision, by which we have the sight of the Most High, subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Again, in a way that's becoming of Him. So then he's going to mention, and again, understand that this is an elementary text. So he's going to mention some of the sins of the eye, and take these as perhaps fundamentals. However, realize that it's not limited to these, right? So he says, protect your eye from 4 things, right? So he'll give us 4, and we can take these as an initial 4 and fundamental 4. However, there may be others, right? So the first one is looking at a marriageable person of the opposite gender, right? So he's saying, do not look at someone who is not mahram. That's what he means, right? La ilaha illallah. So the first thing is guard it, and tandur biha ila ghayri mahram. Don't look at someone who is not mahram for you with your eye. In the madhab of the author, the whole body of the opposite sex who are ajanib, who are not mahram, is awra from this with respect to gaze, right? So in his school, when he says don't look at someone who's not mahram, he means don't look at them at all, except with the excuses that the Sharia gives. An example being medical treatment or transactions, right? That's his school, and his school is tough in that respect. In the case of women, his school orders them to wear niqab. And in the case of men, they're not ordered to wear niqab. However, the women are not permitted to look at their faces. Many of our jurists, and even a position within the Imam school, they say that a woman may expose her hands and face, right? And none of the jurists really order a man to wear a niqab, though they might ask him to remove his face from ladies if he knows they're looking at it. But the hands and the face, when a person is looking without desire, the majority of fuqaha, they'll allow that, right? To see the hands and face of someone from the opposite sex, provided there's not desire or temptation, right? Meaning that someone is not looking with lust at the other person or attraction, and that they're not tempted to fall into something impermissible. In that case, you're not allowed to look at any part of someone who's not a mahram, right? So what is he saying? Lower your gaze from people who aren't mahram. And like a moderate meaning of lowering your gaze is never to look with desire, right? And then if you're honest, and we have, particularly for young people who are unmarried, that means typically you're lowering your gaze, right? Because you're someone who, when you're young and when you're unmarried, your desires are likely to be stronger. And I don't know, a lot of people might claim that they could do that, but maybe there's something in their water or something, because that's not healthy. If they're healthy, you're supposed to be attracted to an attractive person of the opposite sex. That's a healthy human being, right? Allah put you in this earth and placed that in you, and that's a ni'mah that drives towards procreation, which is a virtue, right? In our view, it's a virtue. You're not going to become purified from fitrah. The Christians tried that, and look what's going on in the Catholic Church. It's kedib. It's kedib, right? So young people, what does that mean? You're lowering your gaze. You're lowering your gaze. And from that, we're talking about the face and the hands lowering your gaze, right? Now, if you're a university student, you got to really guard your eyes, right? Because people are showing a whole lot more than just their hands and face, right? And don't delude yourself into thinking that that's permissible, or that you're immune to it, or you're somehow purified above that. That's not a sign of purity. That's not a sign of purity. That's something else, and Allah knows best. Imam al-Ghazali says the most you can do if you have taqwa is protect yourself from doing anything impermissible. And he said, as for your heart and it being affected, he said you won't be able to do it except by marrying, right? Or maybe breaking your desire by fasting, right? That's what the Imam has to say. And we should not be deluded by Christendom. They got it wrong. And what's going on in the Catholic Church right now is just boldly obvious, right? Marriage is a sunnah of all prophets, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, nikah is my sunnah and the sunnah of the prophets. And An-Nabiyun says that you could translate that as a sunnah of all prophets before me, right? Some of them might not have married like John, or Isa hasn't come yet the second time and married, but he will. But they got that wrong. So if you are around a lot of people who are not mahram, and you're a young unmarried person, lower your gaze, right? Lower your gaze. And Allah knows best. Tayyib, what will aid you in that? Fasting will aid you in that, and avoiding consumption of food that stimulates desires like meat. You should reduce that. And you should also lower your gaze, and you should just simply remove yourself from certain environments where you fear slipping into something. Part of sabr in that thing, part of refraining from disobedience with respect to that thing, is to avoid that environment, right? So years ago that might have just been physical environments. Now it's not unlikely that is virtual environments, right? Digital environments. So you have to avoid certain types of websites, or even in devices, avoid them, or what have you, right? Do what it takes to help prevent yourself from disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that way. And then what will help you lower your gaze if you're unable to control that? And again, don't see that as a weakness. That is your human composition. And marrying young is a sunnah, right? Marrying young is a sunnah. So if you're unable to avoid disobedience, the way to deal with that for the one who has the wherewithal is to marry. And the Prophet ﷺ said that. And the well-known hadith of Ibn Mas'ud, Ya ma'ashara shabab, man istata'a minkum al-ba'ata, falyatazawwaj, fa'innahu aghaddu lil-basar wa ahsanu lil-farj. Right? O youth, the one of you who finds the desire and the wherewithal. That's how the word al-ba'a is understood. It's the desire and the means to marry. Then let him marry. for it helps one lower the gaze more and remain more chaste, right? So we're talking about lowering the gaze. An aid in lowering the gaze is to fast, is to marry, right? Is to marry. فَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِيعْ, and then if you're unable to marry, then he should fast, for it will be a protection for him or protection for her. The same applies to a woman, right? So again, lowering one's gaze, not looking at desire at someone who's not mahram. One will help out oneself with this by avoiding environments that are dangerous and doing other things that reduce one's desire, like fasting, like changing one's diet. And the real protection here is to marry. And we should remove all of the obstacles that exist for young people engaging in lawful marriage. And, you know, probably very, very few of us here actually have young people that we're in the position to marry. But many of you are actually on the opposite side. You're young people wanting to marry, and Allah help you. Allah help Muslim kids with modern Muslim parents. Yeah, we need to work on strategies for this. La ilaha illallah. Yes, sir.
But by avoiding meat, does that include fish?
I don't know. I'd be interested in what Sheikh Noor has to say about that. I don't know. Yeah, they say meat, and that does that apply to fish? I don't know. That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. My inclination is it means land animals, but I'm not certain. La ilaha illallah. Okay, so that's the first. Lowering the gaze. You could take as another fundamental of lowering the gaze that the Imam mentions in his book Minhaj al-Abidin, the hadith that the gaze is a poisonous arrow from the arrows of Iblis, from the arrows of the devil. If someone leaves it out of fear of Allah, and it's a hadith Qudsi, if someone leaves it out of fear for me, I give them faith in exchange, therefore, the sweetness of which they'll find in their heart, right? So lowering the gaze is a means of a increase in Iman and finding the sweetness of Iman, right? So if you're challenged by environments, consider those an opportunity to earn an increase in Iman and the sweetness of it by lowering your gaze. Yep, by lowering your gaze. One more point. So he says mahram, ghayr mahram, looking at someone who's not mahram, right? The mahrams are well known. There are 7 that are kin, 7 from wet nursing, and 4 that are in-laws, right? And that's discussed in fiqh books in the section on tahara. And it's also discussed in books in the section on marriage, right? So mothers, daughters, sisters, aunts, nieces, paternal, maternal aunts, and nieces also from brothers and sisters. Yep. So those 7 from wet nursing, and then the in-laws, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, son's wife, father's wife, and then the opposite for the women. So cousins aren't mahram. Cousins aren't mahram. Brother-in-laws aren't mahram. Sister-in-laws aren't mahram. Right? No. And then he says, the second is looking at a beautiful form in a lustful way. So that's beyond just someone who's not mahram, right? And the rule with the fuqaha is looking at anything other than your spouse with lust is prohibited, right? Anything, right? So obviously that applies to screens, right? Obviously, right? And Allah help young people in these times. You know, when I was growing up, there'd be those newspaper things on the corner, and they'd have those, you know, nasty papers, and the people's eyes would be blacked out. And that's all we would, you know, as a young person, you'd see those thrown away here or there. That's all you had to worry about. Nowadays, it's jumping out at you and even pursuing you on your screens. Allahul Musta'an, right? But Allah can facilitate for someone who He wills. He can make it easy to obey. Right? So, and the second is very close to the first, right? La ilaha illallah. 3, from looking at a Muslim with an eye of disdain, right? So it's, what is that? And tandura biha ila Muslim bi'ayn al-ihtiqar. Allahu Akbar, right? So that is like from the hadith, بِحَسْبِ امْرِئٍ مِّنَ الشَّرِّ أَن يَحْكِرَ أَخَاهُ الْمُسْلِمِ. It's sufficient for a person of evil that they have disdain for their Muslim brother or sister, right? So here he's making it a sin of the eye. Really, it's a sin of the heart, right? But it may have a physical manifestation. But the point is the perception of disdain, looking down on a Muslim, right? So it relates to kibr, right? It relates to kibr. It relates to arrogance. Looking down on another Muslim, looking at them with disdain. And here he's saying as a sin of the eye. We might say metaphorically it's a sin of the eye, and literally it's a sin of the heart, right? It's ihtikar is an action of the heart, though again it may have a physical manifestation, right? So don't allow yourself to look down on people, and that again shows you that the sins of the eye are not limited to just desire, right? One does not merely lower one's gaze from desirous gaze, right? And in desirous gaze, not merely the opposite sex, right? Looking at the world with greed is one of the types of things you should lower your gaze from. Looking down on Muslims is one of the things you should lower your gaze from, right? And so on. And then the last one, 4, from being on the lookout for another Muslim's faults, right? What does that mean? Looking for the faults of others, right? And the Prophet ﷺ taught us that someone who seeks out the faults of other Muslims will be disgraced even from the midst of their home, right? Allah will eventually reveal their faults, right? So looking for faults, again, which is, you say that's more of an action of the heart, but it will have a physical manifestation as well, right? It may have a physical manifestation as well. So all of those are things from which one lowers the gaze, right? And that leads to a high meaning of lowering the gaze that encompasses all of these. And one of our teachers was advised by his teacher, who's a senior teacher to each of us. He was traveling from an area that was much more conservative to an area that was less conservative, right? So people would be less covered and what have you. But he advised him with this comprehensive meaning of lowering the gaze. And he said, "Usika ya akhi bighad al-basar amma siwa al-fatir." He said, "I advise you, O my brother, to lower your gaze from everything other than the creator, right? Everything other than the originator." And in a very high meaning, that's what one's lowering one's gaze from, right? La ilaha illallah, from maharim, from dunya, from looking at the faults of others, and Allahul musta'an, right? Allahul musta'an. Ya Arhamar Rahimin. Are there any questions on that before we move on to the year?
Question.
Yes, sir.
So regarding looking at a Muslim with the eye of disdain, so if we, for instance, if we see a Muslim doing something terrible, I guess how are we supposed to look at that?
Disdain for their action, or contempt for the action, not disdain for the individual. So a question is, if we see a Muslim doing something terrible, how do we deal with that and not look at them with disdain? And we said you have to have contempt for the action, right? Or literally hatred. You could say hatred, loathing. You have to loathe the action. However, to determine that the person is beneath you, that's prohibited. And we don't know that, right? They may have many other acts of obedience that vastly surpass ours. And we also, if we're honest, probably know that we have sins that are worse than that given sin we might see them doing, right? Or we should be concerned about that. So again, just simply disliking the action, but not holding the person in contempt. Yeah, not holding the person in disdain, not looking down on them, seeing them as beneath, not seeing them as beneath us, seeing the action as a sinful action. No, thank you.
So I guess my question, so for certain,
All right.
I understand the point about hitting the sin. I guess in terms of disdain, my read onto it being, associating with certain people, right? So, for instance, if you have some Muslim killing other Muslims, or some Muslim, doing something that I think is unacceptable, and I hate the action, and I also don't want to associate with that person regardless of the action. So, think about that.
The word that's being translated as disdain, it doesn't just mean association. It's ihtikar. It's like to see them as base, right? But in this case, is as like beneath you. Yeah, and Allah knows best. So now, if someone's like openly sinful or habitually sinful, we're ordered to avoid that company, but we're not permitted to determine or come to the conclusion that that person is beneath us, because they may repent, and our ultimate station is determined in the hereafter, and by Allah, and will be determined in the hereafter, right? So that doesn't. There's not a contradiction between not seeing oneself as superior to someone and avoiding their company, right? Because it's just the state they're in now. They're not suitable as company for you, perhaps, or I, perhaps. But we can't judge that they're beneath us. Again, there might be things that Allah has concealed of their state that we don't know right now that makes their state very elevated. And it's also quite likely that Allah will guide them to repent, and they'll end up in a very high station. Yeah. And also, every believer, in that they have belief and that they have Islam, they have a station, right? The learned say that were the light of a disobedient believer to be revealed, it would fill what was between the heavens and the earth, right? So even a disobedient believer, they have a lot of light, and there's someone of value. But again, that specific disobedience is just problematic. And he'll talk about the type of company we should keep. And one of the reasons we said that maybe they're not suitable company for us, but they're suitable company for others, is someone else might be able to benefit them, right? Someone else might have a state that is firmly grounded enough and powerful enough that they could help direct that person towards Tawbah, whereas I or someone else may not be able to. But then that goes back to a degree, you could say, a weakness in that person. Whereas, were they to meet someone like the Prophet ﷺ, look at the transformation that he was capable of with the people he met. ﷺ. La ilaha illallah. Yes, sir.
Disobeying the stomach, is it like eating haram?
So, we'll come to that, but that's one of the sins. Yeah, eating haram. But he probably will list specific, avoiding haram, avoiding shubha, and so on. But we'll come to the stomach. He'll list each of them, inshallah ta'ala. La ilaha illallah. Question from a sister? Why don't we pass her the mic? Would you mind passing it to her? I think there's a second mic there. You could try, but a lot of times I'm not able to hear well, so.
The organs that we are responsible for,
Here, you actually is there.
you did not mention the brain, and when we think of shaitan and the whispers of shaitan, and it's hard to tell if it's our own nafs or if it's the whispers. When we think things like that, will we be responsible for that?
Pass it on this side. Yeah. So the question was, is the brain an organ? And the answer is the heart is protected from sin. The heart is the master of all of those organs, right? So it is the faculty by which you govern the other organs. That's one. And then the degree to which we're responsible for our thoughts, that will be discussed, because we'll have a section on sins of the heart, right? And the level of responsibility is not the occurrence of the thought. It's accepting, speaking about, or acting on the thought. right? But we'll go into that in detail in its place, and that's the discussion of the sins of the heart, right? So understand that when he says these organs are governed by the heart, and then the heart has its own sins, which are notions, typically. They're thoughts, and the mere occurrence is not what one's responsible for. Accepting them, acting on them, or speaking about them, that's what one's responsible for. And Allah knows best. And that'll come in its place, inshallah. There's a section on sins of the heart. La ilaha illallah. So that's the eye, right? So we want to, again, the eye, we want to lower the gaze. And aid in that is remembering what it's for, right? Not disobeying Allah with the blessing, and remembering the immense blessings for this eye, or that this eye was created for. Yes, sir.
In terms of university environments, if there's say a discussion section and you're the only guy in a discussion, and lowering your gaze leads to seeing things which are worse than actually looking out.
Allahumma sta'an.
And it's happened a few times, like just wondering.
Right. So now the question on lowering the gaze, what if lowering the gaze leads to seeing worse than having the gaze high? So lowering the gaze, what's meant is averting the gaze, right? And also looking at is not just seeing in your field of vision, but like looking at the thing is what's implied. So you just got to be, you've got to be ingenuitive. You got to be ingenuitive, and some environments you may have to avoid. You know, though, if you have glasses, one trick is take your glasses off. But it depends on whether you're nearsighted or farsighted or what have you, right? No. Allahumma sta'an. Yeah. Environments where Allah is disobeyed are difficult. You know, and that's the blessing of being in environments of obedience, and they're established on the Sunnah of Habib Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Allah grant us to promote that and summon others to that.
Amen.
No. He said, as for the ear, right? So first he said the eye, now the ear. Protect it from listening to reprehensible innovations, right? Bid'ah. Backbiting, which will be defined. Fuhsh, lewd talk. Fuhsh is that which goes beyond the proper bounds, right? Such that it's inappropriate. So it might be lewd or other things that are out of bounds, right? So if we say that, then like, where is that from much of popular culture, right? Particularly modern music. And unfortunately, you know, the sister and I talk about this, you know, what in the world has happened to black music? It's horrible. You know, wallahi, that's part of the tricks of the enemy. You know, it's just full of profanity. Profanity is fuhsh, right? Expletives, right? Cuss words, that's fuhsh. And the Prophet was laysa nabi bifahash, right? No, the Prophet ﷺ was not someone who would speak in a way that was inappropriate. Lam yakun an-nabi fahishan wa la mutafahishan, right? He was not beyond bounds in temperament or in behavior, ﷺ, right? Al-khawd fil batil, plunging into falsehood. Sheikh Nuh translates that as talking about what's useless and immoral. So that entails talking about the disobedience of others. So people just talking about disobedience, that's not something to listen to. Yarhamakallah. Talking about the faults of others, right? Right? So he mentions avoiding these types of reprehensible speech. One of them in innovations, right? So what is that? That's like listening to Mu'tazilite theological arguments. That's bid'ah, right? That's bid'ah. Bid'ah typically applies to in creed. Sin in tenets of faith. When they say bid'ah as like a vocabulary, That's what they mean typically, right? So listening to someone talking about that, right? Listening to Rafidite creed, Bid'ah, right? Protect your ear from it. Shiite creed, right? Misspeech towards the companions. It's Bid'ah. Nasallallahu alafiyah. Anthropomorphists, listen to what they have to say. Bid'ah. You know, we met someone in a honey dealer in a certain country. Did you hit me again? Right? They went after the honey shops because they said they were supporting UBL, right? He asked me, where is Allah? That's bid'ah. That question is bid'ah, right? Listening to that, you shouldn't use your ear for that. Khawd fil batil, plunging into falsehood. So your philosophy professor that talks about heresy no, it's not heresy, atheism and agnosticism. Khawd fil batil, right? We are ordered not to sit with people when they do khawd in Allah's signs, right? Those are things we should protect our ears from. Oh, Abdul Karim, you're being too tough. I'm not being too tough. We got a whole lot of young people with crises in faith from listening to that kind of drama. So what's the answer? Build our own universities, right? I'm serious. I am totally serious. The Christians have done it. The Jews have done it, right? Muslims are starting to do it. Allah reward those for working on Zaytuna College and other Muslim institutions. We need institutions where our young people's beliefs aren't challenged, right? Where they don't have to sit and listen to khawd fil batil out for a decade of their life in their formative years. Sit and listen to khawd fil batil, and be in an environment where they can't lower their gaze without seeing right? We need our own institutions. Right? As much as we have to say as much as people have to criticize about the creed of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, at least they knew well enough not to give their kids over to their enemies, right? And they established Claire Muhammad schools. We need to revisit some of that thought, right? That was a wise move. And we need to do the same. Allahu Akbar. Sunni schools. Faddal. Sunni schools, right? Where we don't have to hear bid'ah and khawd fil batil from people that our young people should look up to and treat with respect, their professors and teachers. And he said, so again, he's going to repeat this fundamental, which is to think about what Allah created and gifted us this organ for. He said, for verily the ear is created for you only to listen to the speech of Allah Most High. Right? The ear was created to hear the speech of Allah in this world and the next. Right? In this world, you hear it recited from the heirs of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? In the next world, you can hear Allah recite it to you. Right? Allah recites Surah Al-Rahman in Jannah. Believers hear it. Right? Our ear was created for that. To listen to the Sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? The ear was created to listen to the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. To the wisdom of the friends of Allah, right? To the hikmah of the awliya. What is a wali? The awliya is a plural of wali. A wali is man tawalat ta'atu, right? Is someone who continually obeyed Allah, or man tawallallahu amrahu. Fatawalat ta'atu, someone who Allah cared for his whole affair, so he constantly obeyed Allah. That's the wali. So listening to the wisdom of those people, right? And they're the ones who will best teach you the book and the sunnah. Now, your ear is also so that by it you might gain access to the benefits of knowledge, right? Knowledge is transmitted more through the ear than through the eye. Right? By which you may reach the eternal dominion and everlasting bounty, right? So all of that is of benefit, are benefits of the ear, right? So we should think about that and not soil it by listening to the likes of what was mentioned, right? And then he'll give us specific things. He won't actually give us specific. He gave those specific before. He said, So if you use the ear to listen to something disliked, meaning disliked by Allah, then what was in your favor will be against you. And what was meant to be a reason for your success will become a reason for your destruction. And this is the ultimate loss, right? Nasallallahu alafiyah. And the same, this is a principle, and the same applies to every one of these limbs, right? That if we use it as a tool for obedience, it's a means by which we gain immense reward, right? And reap blessings and experience divine beauty, majesty, and perfection. And if we disobey Allah with it, it becomes a cause of loss and may lead to our destruction, waliyadu billah ta'ala, and may testify against us on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Nasallallahu alafiyah. And he said, also do not think that the sin will be attributed only to the one who speaks it. Ya Latif. And not to the one who listens. For verily it is said in a narration, truly the listener shares in sin with the speaker, and he is one of the two backbiters. So that is narrated by Tabarani. He says Iraqi from Tabarani. What is that referring to? That is referring to the hadith master Al-Iraqi, who did compiled the citations of the hadith from Ihya, right? So he quotes this hadith in Ihya, and Al-Iraqi says it's from Tabarani, right? So what is that saying? What that's saying is all of the types of forbidden speech that he's going to list when he talks about the tongue, the same apply to the ear. So we can't listen to backbiting. We can't listen to carrying tales, right? As was mentioned, you don't listen to useless and immoral speech, just like you don't allow yourself to engage in useless and immoral speech, right? So listening here, viewing would apply to that as well, right? Just as speech, writing applies, the rules of speech apply to writing, right? The rules of listening apply to media, right? So anti-social media, right? Whole lot of vain speech, code fil batil, what have you. Some of the students, Allah bless them, they shut down their Facebook, right? Maybe they only turn it on for khidmah and turn it back off. And they found when they turn it on, they feel a spiritual heaviness. It's full of code fil batil, right? And when we talk about speech, like if you want a general principle of speech, it's the hadith narrated by Sayyidina al-Hussein, right? Min husn al-Islam al-mar'i tarkuhu ma la ya'ni. From the good of a person's Islam is leaving that which does not concern him or her, right? So a whole lot of the digital media we engage in falls into that category of that which does not concern us, right? And so we should be cautious, right? Particularly, we will counsel young people right now about defamatory speech, right? Defamatory speech. And in our community, and spread this among your, keep this as counsel your companions, right? Your friends and your peers, your fellow millennials, right? Who's after the millennials? Generation Y, then generation what? Z? Are we up to Z?
Lord.
Allahu Alam. Generation Snapchat, right? Whatever. Counsel them. Like, one of the fitan of our age, the ladies, the mic that's on your side is feeding back. If you just stick it so that it's ahead of the speaker, behind the speaker, it won't feed back. If it's further away from, behind where the speaker's pointing, it won't feed back. One of the fitan of our age is, Muslim leaders who people disagree with. They might make this statement or that people disagree with, and then people jump on social media and defame them. Listening to that's not permissible. Just like doing it's not permissible. And it's poor manners, and it's not proper conduct towards leadership, right? And commanding the good and forbidding the wrong is a chapter in knowledge, right? And one of the elements of that is the subjects cannot command and forbid rulers in the same way that leaders command and forbid subjects, right? Just as children cannot command and forbid their parents, the same way their parents command and forbid them. Just as a wife cannot command and forbid her husband, the same way a husband commands and forbids the wife, Why? Because in each case, one person is in a greater position of responsibility, right? And one can't violate that hierarchy that Allah has established, right? And when we do so, we disrupt the social order, right? So if we, we were on a certain forum with a group of leaders, and some of them was kind of jumping on the one of them was kind of jumping on the bandwagon when Sheikh so-and-so was being criticized. And I said to another one of the brothers, he should be careful because in a few weeks it'll be him, right? Because if you tear down our clergy, that brings them all down, right? So you might not Salafi Sheikh so-and-so, and he makes a mistake, so hey, let's jump on his case, right? But you do that, then what's going to happen? It'll be your sheikh next time, right? Because we've just torn down clergy and brought it down to a level. And why are we digressing to this? Just because it goes back to the things we shouldn't listen to and engage in, right? So like even following that stuff, it's not of benefit. I remember years ago, more than a decade ago, a certain scholar took positions that people disliked. Someone wrote an open letter against them. So I'm not going to read that. It's not the type of thing we should listen to, right? Defamatory speech, slander, ghiba, it's harmful, right? And they say the flesh of scholars is poison, right? Ghiba is bad enough, but if you do ghiba of the salihin, it's worse, right? Ghiba of the salihin, it's backbiting the pious and the learned, it's worse for you, right? So be very cautious of that. But anyone. And as I say this is an admonition for me, even a lot of our news. We should just, avoid the news. And news in Arabic, news is akhbar, right? And one of our shuyukh said, they say that because mafi akhbar, you won't find a pious brother in the news, right? Mafi akhbar, kullu khawd fil batil and ghiba and ya latif. So all of that, we should be cautious. We should be cautious of it. Be cautious of, again, listening and consuming media is essentially listening, right? Producing media, whether that be print, recording, or what have you, treat that as speaking, right? So these etiquettes apply to that. Ya Arhamar Rahimin. La ilaha illallah. Are there questions on that? And we'll stop here. We'll move to the tongue after this.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question.
Walaikum.
What is this phrase that you keep using? Something batil.
El khawd fil batil. Thank you.
What is that? Could you please explain that, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I keep anything I don't translate. Thank you for reminding me. So he says, delving into falsehood. That is the translation of it. Delving into falsehood. And we mentioned that Sheikh Nuh Keller talks. He translates it as talking about that which is useless and immoral. Right? So that would say listening to that which is useless and immoral. Right? So that's like an example of it is talking about heretical notions and creed. Heresy is a form of it. And also just talking about sin. Right? People just talking about their sin. That's an example of khawd fil batil, of talking about the useless and immoral or delving into falsehood. Right? And they use that term. In Arabic, it means to plunge, right? So it's plunging into that which is false, right? And it's mentioned a couple places in the Quran and it's mentioned in Hadith. That's why they use that phrase, but there are various manifestations. And again, as we mentioned, talking about sin, talking about that which is immoral, talking about, so like what would be an example of that? Like people talking about, all of the type of sins that take place in Atlantic City, right? A casino town. And out in the West Coast, they'd say Las Vegas. Oh man, it's so bad. They have, showgirls and they have slots and there's all of this and there's all of that. Just talking about that is khawd fil batil. Much less our own sins. That's even worse, right? Those are examples. And if you would like a more detailed treatment, Allah yubarak fikum, Allah bless you, the questioner and all of the students, in the section on holding one's tongue from reliance of the traveler, he goes into this in more detail with examples, right? And the Imam may too, when we get to the section of forbidden speech, which is will be our next couple of lessons, inshallah ta'ala.
Assalamualaikum.
Wa alaikum
You
salam.
mentioned news, listening to the news, especially all the things that are going on right now with the government. Is that not good to listen to?
Some of it may not be. Yeah, some of it may not be. So the question is the news. Some of it is perhaps would fall into that category. And it's unfortunate because, maybe 2 decades ago, a lot of this would have been in like tabloids. It would have been in National Enquirer, and you would have passed by it on your way at the checkout counter and just, thought that that's what kind of bored old ladies, stop not to get on their case, but what they read about of gossip, you would have just disregarded it. But now it's main news, the primary news outlets are engaging in it. A lot of that stuff, one wants to be careful of it. Yeah, one wants to be careful.
There's a term they would call it layani, and it's useless talk.
La yani, yep.
That does not benefit you.
It's not your business. Yeah,
Akhirah.
it's not your business. Yep. And then what's your business? What benefits you in this life or the next? Allahu Akbar. Yeah. When we were studying, our shuyukh wouldn't allow us to follow the news. And they said, don't tell the students. It's not their business. They don't need to hear it. We don't want anybody to distract them with it. And I know sheikhs of spiritual paths that tell their students not to follow the news. Yeah. But again, there's exceptions. There's exceptions. I made, due to a mistake I made some years ago, the first khutbah after the Arab Spring started, and I had been traveling since like Thursday. I think it jumped off on Thursday, and I was just, traveling interstate and then getting to a place and delivering lessons and getting up and delivering a khutbah I already prepared, and I didn't check the news before doing khutbah, so I didn't reference it at all. And this very angry, Arab American man came up to me after a khutbah. So if you're in a position of public service, you do have to know some of what's going on. But if it doesn't pertain to you, it probably is best. Much of it is best avoided, and some of it would fall into this category. Yeah, some of it would fall into, not all of it, but some of it would fall into this category. Yeah.
Assalamualaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Could you speak to these prohibitions as they relate to children's cinema with the witchcraft and whatnot in the entertainment for children?
We would just say that anything that applies to adults applies to children, and just in principle, just treat consumption of media as listening, right? So anything that's forbidden for us to listen to, we should not allow our children to consume it as well, right? That's as much as we could say. Witchcraft is impermissible, right? So like things that celebrate witchcraft, that's a type of media that we should be cautious of, and some of it we may have to explain that that's an impermissible portion of a story. Maybe there's a greater moral that they're learning, but they might have to learn that some section of it is an impermissible portion, and help them navigate it. But certainly we should be very cautious. We should be very cautious. Media consumption. And another thing about media is its companionship, right? Rules of listening apply to it. Rules of viewing apply to it. Some of the images will be impermissible or permissible. And also you're keeping the company of the producers of that media. So they're your companions, right? And also that those acting in the media are while you're viewing that, while you're consuming that media, those are your companions, right? And we know what the Prophet ﷺ, the things the Prophet ﷺ said about the type of company we should keep, that applies to that. So as parents, we have to be very very astute, very cautious and astute as to what media we allow our children to view, and how we guide them in their consumption of media. And I'm not suggesting that we entirely cut them off from it, because that will probably have the opposite effect. But there should be some guided consumption if there is consumption, and some things should be prohibited, and we should explain why. And Allahul Musta'an wa alayhi tuklan. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Yes, sir.
The when he mentions talking about the faults of others, is that only when talking about the faults of specific others, or, for instance, if I or could it also, or would it also include the faults of a generic other who exists, but I don't know, it's anonymized or whatever?
Can you give a more specific
So,
example?
for instance, if I'm helping manage a mosque or something, and we're learning about, we're talking about the Catholic Church, maybe we have some other similar issues in some other parts of this country. How can we help our organizations, avoid those sorts of issues or have safeguards? So I don't need to know what happened in City X, but I know that it happened, and I know that we need to somehow take measures.
No, that's not. Yeah, that's even a specific person. If it's a case and you're in a responsible position, it could be discussed, right? And also for like hiring, it could be, faults can be discussed. Yeah. And Allah knows best. This is talking about like looking for people's faults, right? Looking for them, or was it in the speech, or was it in the eye?
It was in the ear.
It was in the ear. Let's see.
And so it was both.
Yeah, listening. The word that's being dhikri, yeah, dhikri, mentioning people's faults. You could add to that unnecessarily, right? Unnecessarily, right? As opposed, because ghiba, even there's exceptions, right? Like warning someone is an exception, right? And Allah knows best. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Faddal. Wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah. So we'll close, inshallah ta'ala, and we will resume the week after next. For the upcoming weeks, I have a lesson on the East Coast, the last weekend of the month. So we will, there will probably be Sir and Salawat, but not this lesson for the next couple of months. And that we may adjust that. Right now, the schedule is somewhat experimental as we're moving into our space and getting an idea of the sustainability of various schedules. So we may make some adjustments, inshallah ta'ala. But for this month and next month, the last Sunday, we will recess from this lesson, inshallah ta'ala. The Sir and Salawat should continue. Fatiha, we please recite Fatiha, seeking from Allah that He grant us to be honest and sincere, that He accept our works, give us good teaching and calling and guidance, that Allah be pleased with us and please the heart of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the Fatiha we recite go to our parents, our teachers, our sheikhs, anyone we owe rights, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam al-Fatiha. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك